The moment my husband told me to apologize to his mother was the moment I realized I had been fighting the wrong battle for years. My name is Lauren Mitchell, and if you had met me a year ago, you probably would have described my life as stable. I had a good career, a comfortable home in the suburbs, and a husband I genuinely believed would stand beside me no matter what. Looking back now, I realize how dangerous assumptions can be. The night everything changed started like dozens of family dinners before it. Ethan and I drove 20 minutes across town to his mother's house for her monthly Sunday gathering. Diane loved hosting those dinners. She loved choosing the menu, arranging the table settings, and making sure every detail reflected her standards. By the time we arrived, several relatives were already there. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic filled the house. Conversations drifted through the dining room. On the surface, everything looked warm and welcoming. I walked in carrying a homemade peach cobbler I had spent the afternoon baking. Diane took one look at it and smiled. "That is sweet," she said, "although nobody really comes here for the desserts." A few people laughed politely. I forced a smile and handed her the dish. It was not a terrible comment. Not on its own. The problem was that comments like that had been happening for years. Small enough to deny, sharp enough to hurt. During dinner, the pattern continued. My job came up in conversation when Ethan's cousin asked about a project I had recently completed. Before I could answer, Diane jumped in. "Lauren works too hard. I always tell Ethan that family should come first." I looked down at my plate. The project she was referring to had earned me a promotion 3 months earlier. Ethan knew how hard I had worked for it. He also knew how proud I had been. Yet he remained silent. The conversation moved on. Later, someone mentioned a vacation Ethan and I had taken the previous summer. Diane laughed softly. They only chose that destination because Lauren likes being in control. More laughter. More silence from Ethan. Each comment by itself seemed harmless. Together, they felt like tiny cuts that never had a chance to heal. As the evening continued, I found myself watching my husband more than his mother. Every time Diane made a remark, I waited. Every time I waited, nothing happened. He smiled. He changed the subject. He looked at his phone. Anything except addressing what was happening. Around 9 o'clock, coffee was served in the living room. Family members gathered around with dessert plates balanced on their laps. That was when Diane delivered the comment that changed everything. She looked directly at me and said, "Sometimes I wonder how much easier Ethan's life would be if he had married someone less difficult." The room went quiet. Not completely silent, but quiet enough for everyone to understand exactly what had been said. My heart sank. I turned toward Ethan. I expected surprise. I expected discomfort. I expected something. Instead, he slowly set down his coffee cup and sighed. It was not the reaction I had expected. It was not even close. I waited for him to say something. Anything. A joke. A correction. A simple statement that his mother had crossed a line. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then Ethan looked at me and gave a small shrug. "Mom does not mean it that way." The room seemed to exhale all at once. A few relatives looked away. Others suddenly became very interested in their dessert plates. Diane smiled into her coffee as though nothing unusual had happened. I felt heat rise into my face. Not because of her comment. Not anymore. Because of his response. I had spent years believing that if things ever became serious enough, Ethan would step in. That if a line was ever clearly crossed, he would finally see what I had been seeing. Instead, he acted as though I was the problem for noticing it. I set my plate on the side table and stood. "I think I need some air," I said quietly. Nobody stopped me. The cool evening breeze hit my face the moment I stepped onto the back patio. The sun had already disappeared below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in deep shades of blue and gray. I wrapped my arms around myself and stared across the backyard. Children's toys from previous family gatherings sat near the fence. Wind chimes moved gently in the distance. For a few minutes, I simply stood there. Then the patio door opened behind me. Ethan stepped outside. "Lauren." I did not turn around. "What?" His voice carried that familiar tone. The one he used whenever he thought I was overreacting. "You are making this into a bigger deal than it is." I laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because I could not believe he had actually said that. "A bigger deal?" I finally turned toward him. "Your mother just insulted me in front of your entire family." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "She was joking." Nobody laughed. He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked away. That tiny movement told me everything. He knew exactly what had happened. He just did not want to deal with it. You always expect the worst from her, he said. The words landed harder than Diane's comment ever could. Because suddenly I understood something. This conversation was not about tonight. It was about every time I had tried to explain how I felt. Every time I had asked him to pay attention. Every time he had dismissed my concerns because acknowledging them would require action. The patio door opened again. Diane stepped outside carrying a glass of iced tea. Her expression looked concerned, almost maternal. If someone had not witnessed the previous hour, they would have thought she was trying to help. "Lauren," she said softly, "I am sorry if your feelings were hurt." The wording caught my attention immediately. Not sorry for what she said. Sorry if my feelings were hurt. Ethan nodded as though this solved everything. And for the first time that night, a feeling settled over me that had nothing to do with anger. It felt much closer to disappointment. Disappointment stayed with me the entire drive home. Ethan talked about ordinary things as though the evening had ended normally. Traffic, work, a movie someone had recommended. I answered when necessary, but my mind remained on the patio, on Diane's carefully chosen words, on Ethan's willingness to accept them. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I felt exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Inside the house, I changed into comfortable clothes and sat on the edge of the bed. Ethan walked in a few minutes later carrying his phone. He looked relieved, as if the situation had already been resolved. "Mom feels bad," he said. I stared at him. "Does she?" "Yes." He sat down beside me. "She even apologized." I thought about the exact words she had used. "Sorry if your feelings were hurt." It was remarkable how often people called something an apology when it required no accountability at all. "That was not an apology," I said quietly. Ethan sighed. "Lauren, why does everything have to become a conflict?" The question caught me off guard. Not because it was new, because I suddenly realized how often he used it. Whenever I raised a concern, whenever I expressed discomfort, whenever I pointed out something unfair, the issue somehow became my reaction instead of the behavior that caused it. I looked at him for several seconds. "Do you really think I created tonight's conflict?" Ethan looked frustrated. "I think everyone was having a good time until you got upset." The room fell silent. There it was. The sentence I would remember long after I forgot the details of the dinner itself. Everyone was having a good time until you got upset. Not until Diane made the comment. Not until she insulted me. Until I reacted. Until I stopped pretending it was acceptable. Ethan stood and headed toward the bathroom. The conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun. I remained seated on the bed staring at the closed door. For the first time, I stopped thinking about whether Diane liked me. I stopped wondering whether future family gatherings would improve. I stopped asking myself what I could do differently. A much more uncomfortable question had taken its place. What happens when the person who is supposed to protect the relationship cares more about avoiding conflict than protecting you? The next morning, I met my friend Sarah for coffee at a small cafe near downtown. She took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. We found a table by the window, and I told her everything. The dinner, the patio conversation, the apology that was not really an apology. Most importantly, Ethan's reaction. Sarah listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, she stirred her coffee slowly and looked at me. "Lauren, can I ask you something?" I nodded. "When was the last time Ethan actually stood up for you when his mother was involved?" I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped. One memory should have come immediately. It did not. Instead, I found myself searching through years of family gatherings, holidays, birthdays, and dinners. The longer I searched, the more uncomfortable I became. Because for the first time, I realized I could not think of a single example. The question Sarah asked stayed with me long after we left the cafe. I drove home slowly, replaying years of memories I had never examined closely before. At every family holiday, Ethan had asked me to be patient. At every uncomfortable gathering, he had asked me to let things go. At every conflict, he had focused on keeping his mother happy rather than addressing the problem. None of those moments had seemed large enough to define a marriage. Together, however, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. That evening, I found myself sitting alone at the kitchen table while Ethan worked late. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of traffic outside. I opened an old photo album from our wedding. In one picture, Diane stood between us during the reception. In another, she was holding Ethan's arm while I stood slightly to the side. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Looking at the images now, I felt something different. Not anger. Recognition. Around 8 o'clock, Ethan finally came home. He greeted me with a quick kiss on the forehead and immediately began talking about his day. I listened quietly. When he finished, I asked a simple question. Do you think your mother respects me? He looked surprised. Of course she does. I nodded slowly. What makes you believe that? Ethan opened the refrigerator and stared inside for several seconds. She invites you to family events. She includes you in things. The answer felt strangely revealing. Not because it was convincing, because it was so superficial. Inviting someone into a room is not the same as respecting them, I said. Ethan closed the refrigerator door. Lauren, why are we still talking about this? There it was again. The desire to move on without understanding anything. The need for peace without accountability. I took a deep breath. Because I am tired of pretending everything is fine. Ethan crossed his arms. Nothing is ever good enough for you when it comes to my mother. The words hit harder than I expected. For a moment, I simply stared at him. Then something inside me became very still. Do you really believe that? I asked quietly. Or is it easier than admitting there is a problem? Ethan looked away immediately. That small reaction told me more than any answer could have. The conversation ended soon after. Not because we reached an agreement. Because neither of us knew what to say next. Later that night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. For years, I had focused on changing Diane's behavior. I had hoped for understanding. I had hoped for respect. I had hoped things would improve naturally with time. Now I was beginning to understand that the real issue was not whether Diane changed. The real issue was whether Ethan was willing to see what was happening. And for the first time since our marriage began, I was no longer certain that he would. The turning point arrived 3 days later. Not during a family gathering. Not during an argument. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday evening. Ethan and I were finishing dinner when his phone rang. Diane's name appeared on the screen. He answered immediately. I continued clearing plates from the table while he spoke with her in the living room. At first, I paid little attention. Then I heard my name. A few seconds later, I heard it again. Something in his tone made me stop. He sounded apologetic. Careful. The way he always sounded when trying to manage his mother's emotions. After several minutes, he ended the call and walked back into the kitchen. His expression looked tense. I dried my hands and waited. What happened? I asked. Ethan leaned against the counter. Mom is still upset about Sunday. I stared at him. She is upset. She thinks things got blown out of proportion. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. Diane had insulted me. Diane had offered a meaningless apology. Yet somehow she had become the injured party. I took a slow breath. And Ethan hesitated. That hesitation immediately made me nervous. He rubbed his forehead before finally speaking. She feels like you owe her an apology. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misunderstood him. The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. Excuse me. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. She thinks you embarrassed her in front of the family. I stared at him. Every conversation from the past week flashed through my mind. Every excuse. Every dismissal. Every moment he had chosen comfort over honesty. And what do you think? I asked. Ethan looked away. That was all the answer I needed. Still, I waited. I needed to hear him say it. Several seconds passed before he finally spoke. I think apologizing would help everyone move forward. The words landed like a door closing. Not because they were shocking. Because they confirmed everything I had been afraid to admit. I felt strangely calm. Calmer than I had been in days. So let me understand this, I said. Your mother insults me in front of the entire family. She refuses to take responsibility. And your solution is for me to apologize. Ethan sighed heavily. Why are you making this so difficult? That question changed everything. Not because it was cruel. Because it revealed exactly how he saw the situation. He was not concerned about fairness. He was concerned about convenience. He wanted the discomfort to disappear. He wanted peace restored. He simply expected me to be the one who paid for it. I looked at the man I had been married to for 6 years and suddenly felt a distance I had never felt before. The realization was painful, but also clarifying. Diane was not controlling my marriage. Ethan was shaping it with every choice he made. Every silence. Every excuse. Every time he asked me to accept what he would never accept himself. The room fell silent. Ethan waited for an argument, a debate, a negotiation. Instead, I looked at him and quietly said, I need some time to think. For the first time all week, I stopped, trying to convince him to understand. And deep down, I think that frightened him more than any argument ever could. That night, I sat alone in the guest room for nearly 2 hours. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I did not rehearse arguments in my head. Instead, I thought about the version of myself that had spent years trying to keep everyone comfortable. I thought about every holiday where I smiled through discomfort. Every family dinner where I ignored comments that should never have been ignored. Every conversation where I accepted less respect than I deserved because I believed patience would eventually solve the problem. The realization was painful. Patience had not solved anything. It had only taught people what I was willing to tolerate. Around midnight, I heard Ethan walking through the hallway. He stopped outside the guest room door for a moment before knocking softly. "Lauren." I stared at the ceiling. "Yes. Can we talk?" I considered the question carefully. For years, I would have opened the door immediately. This time, I remained where I was. "Not tonight." Silence followed. Then his footsteps slowly disappeared. The next morning, I woke up feeling strangely clear-headed. Not happy, not relieved, just clear. For the first time, I was no longer focused on changing Diane. I was no longer trying to win her approval. The question in front of me was much simpler. Could I stay in a marriage where my feelings were always negotiable whenever his mother was involved? Later that afternoon, Sarah called to check on me. We spoke for nearly an hour. I told her everything that had happened since our coffee meeting. When I repeated Ethan's request that I apologize, Sarah became very quiet. "Lauren," she finally said, "if someone else told you this story, what advice would you give them?" The question caught me off guard. I leaned back on the couch and thought about it. If a friend described years of disrespect followed by a husband demanding an apology from the wrong person, what would I tell her? The answer came immediately. I would tell her to stop sacrificing herself for peace that only benefited everyone else. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. Then I did something I had not planned to do. I walked upstairs and opened the closet in the guest room. I pulled out a medium-sized suitcase and placed it on the bed. The sight of it made my heart race. Not because I was making a dramatic decision, because I was finally taking my own feelings seriously. I folded a few outfits, gathered basic necessities, packed enough for several days. Nothing more, nothing less. When Ethan came home from work and saw the suitcase, he froze. "What is that?" he asked. I looked at him calmly. "I am going to stay with Sarah for a little while." His face immediately changed. Confusion gave way to concern. "You are leaving?" I nodded. "I need space." Ethan stared at the suitcase as though it had appeared from nowhere. As though the conversation in the kitchen had never happened. As though consequences were something that only happened to other people. "Lauren, this is ridiculous," he said. I shook my head slowly. "No. What is ridiculous is asking me to apologize for being disrespected." For the first time since all of this began, Ethan had no immediate response. And for the first time in years, neither did I. I simply zipped the suitcase closed. The drive to Sarah's apartment took less than 15 minutes, but it felt much longer. Every traffic light gave me another chance to turn around. Every mile gave me another opportunity to convince myself that I was overreacting. I did not take any of them. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Certainty. Sarah opened the door before I even reached the building. One look at the suitcase in my hand told her everything she needed to know. She did not ask questions. She simply stepped aside and let me in. The next few days were strangely peaceful. I continued working remotely. I took walks in the neighborhood. I drank coffee on Sarah's balcony in the mornings. For the first time in years, I was not constantly preparing myself for the next uncomfortable family interaction. Ethan called several times during the first day. I did not answer. He left messages instead. At first, they sounded frustrated, then confused, then worried. By the third day, the messages became quieter, more reflective. Still, I was not ready to talk. What surprised me most was how quickly other people noticed my absence. Ethan's aunt called to check on me. A cousin sent a message asking if everything was all right. Even people who had never involved themselves in family disagreements seemed aware that something significant had happened. The situation could no longer be hidden behind polite smiles and convenient explanations. One afternoon, Sarah came home carrying takeout and an expression I immediately recognized. "What?" I asked. She sat across from me at the kitchen table. I ran into Ethan's cousin at the grocery store. My stomach tightened slightly, and Sarah opened her drink before answering. "Apparently people have been talking." I laughed softly, not because it was funny, Because it was inevitable. Family systems often depend on everyone pretending certain things are normal. The moment someone stops pretending, people start asking questions. Sarah continued. Several relatives had privately admitted they always felt uncomfortable with the way Diane treated me. Others had noticed Ethan's habit of staying silent. Nobody had said anything before because nobody wanted conflict. Hearing that should have made me feel validated. Instead, it made me sad. How many years had everyone watched the same pattern unfold? That evening, my phone rang again. Ethan. This time, I answered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said my name. The frustration was gone. The defensiveness was gone. What remained sounded very different. The house feels empty, he admitted. I looked out the apartment window at the city lights below. That is not the real problem, Ethan. Silence followed. Longer this time. I know, he finally said. For the first time since I left, he did not mention his mother. He did not ask me to move on. He did not tell me I was making things difficult. And somehow, that small change mattered more than any apology he had offered so far. The conversation stayed with me long after the call ended. I sat alone on Sarah's balcony, watching headlights move through the streets below. For the first time since I left, I sensed that something was changing. Not because Ethan missed me. Not because the house felt empty. Because he had finally stopped talking about the situation as though it were an inconvenience. He was beginning to see it as a consequence. 2 days later, he asked if we could meet in person. I agreed. We chose a small park halfway between Sarah's apartment and our house. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon. Families walked along the paths. Children played near the fountain. The setting felt ordinary, which somehow made the conversation easier. Ethan arrived first. When I saw him sitting on a bench beneath a large oak tree, he looked different. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence he usually carried was gone. I sat beside him, leaving a small space between us. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan took a deep breath. I talked to Aunt Carol. That surprised me. Aunt Carol rarely involved herself in family conflicts. What did she say? Ethan looked down at his hands. She told me something I did not want to hear. He paused. She said everyone has been protecting Mom from the consequences of her behavior for years. I remained silent. Ethan continued. He explained that after I left, several relatives had shared their experiences. Different stories. Different situations. Yet all of them described the same pattern. Diane would make a hurtful comment, then act offended when someone reacted. Other people would smooth things over. The cycle would continue. I always thought I was keeping the peace, Ethan admitted. But I was really protecting the problem. Hearing him say those words felt strange. Not because they erased what happened, because they showed a level of honesty I had not seen before. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. There were no dramatic speeches. No attempts to blame anyone else. Ethan listened when I spoke. Really listened. For the first time in years, I did not feel like I was arguing with him. I felt like he was finally paying attention. Before we left, he said something that mattered more than everything else. I kept asking you to accept things I would never accept myself. The honesty in that sentence left me speechless. As I drove back to Sarah's apartment later that afternoon, I realized something important. The problem had never been whether Ethan loved me. The problem was whether he was willing to challenge habits that had existed long before I entered his life. For the first time, it seemed possible that he might be willing to do exactly that. Over the next several weeks, Ethan and I continued talking. Not every conversation was easy. Some were uncomfortable. Some forced us to examine habits we had both ignored for years. The difference was that he no longer treated those conversations like obstacles. He treated them like responsibilities. One evening, about a month after our meeting in the park, he asked if I would come home and have dinner with him. Not to pretend everything was fixed. Not to return to the way things had been. Just to talk. When I arrived, the house felt familiar but different. The tension that had once filled every room seemed absent. We sat at the kitchen table and spoke for nearly 3 hours. Ethan told me about several conversations he had with family members. He admitted how difficult it had been to hear perspectives he had spent years dismissing. He also told me something I never expected. He had met with Diane and established boundaries. Real boundaries. Not vague promises. Clear expectations. Respectful treatment. Accountability. Consequences if those expectations were ignored. For a moment, I simply stared at him. Not because boundaries solved everything. Because he had finally taken ownership of something he once expected me to carry alone. A few days later, Diane called. I almost did not answer. When I did, her voice sounded different. Less confident. Less certain. The conversation was brief. She did not become a different person overnight. Neither of us pretended otherwise. But for the first time, she acknowledged that some of her comments had been hurtful. It was not a perfect apology. It was not dramatic. Yet it contained something that had been missing before. Responsibility. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. Then I realized something surprising. I no longer needed her approval. I no longer needed her to understand me completely. The peace I had been searching for all those years was never going to come from changing her. It came from changing what I was willing to accept. A week later, I moved back home. Slowly, carefully, not because everything was perfect, because we had finally started building something healthier. Ethan met me at the front door, carrying one of my boxes. He smiled nervously. I smiled back. Neither of us pretended the past had not happened. We simply understood it differently now. Sometimes people ask whether leaving was the right decision. The truth is that leaving was not about punishment. It was about clarity. Distance forced both of us to see things we could not see while living inside the problem. Looking back now, the most important moment was not the dinner. It was not the argument. It was not even the request that changed everything. The most important moment happened when I stopped sacrificing my own peace to keep everyone else comfortable. That choice changed the direction of my marriage. It changed the way I viewed myself. And it taught me a lesson I will carry for the rest of my life. The people who truly love you do not ask you to shrink yourself so conflict can disappear. They stand beside you and help create a life where respect no longer depends on silence.